you very much, Jared. And I wanted to thank Jared and the Loft for this opportunity, and to the mentors who have been very generous with their time and talent. And also a very heartfelt thank you to the recently late Chinua Achebe, who built the stage I'm standing on. War stories. This time, my mother and I were fighting about what I had done at school to prove with no question that Anita Okechukwu was not wearing a bra. That Anita and I had been in the middle of the playground didn't bother me. That there were boys around hadn't bothered me. But Anita Okechukwu was far more sensitive than I. Wando, you can't just go around opening people's shirts, my mother said, after she closed the door on Mrs. Okechukwu, a broad-shouldered, broad-hipped woman whose need for a bra was unassailable. She'd wanted an apology and an explanation, and my mother was ready with the first, but unsure of the second. That's when she'd called me onto the veranda to explain myself. I wanted to tell them about how Anita had started the girl club after claiming that her father had sent her expensive bras from London, edged with barely there lace and soft ribbons and powdered with fairy dust, and how she'd made the rule that only girls with bras could be in the girl club, and that if you weren't in the girl club, you couldn't sit in the girl area and had to play with the boys. Anita would confirm who was girl by escorting the applicant behind the school to check if she was wearing the required undergarment. They both emerged short minutes later, the bra princess followed by her newest lady-in-waiting. In the jostle to be a girl, with friends borrowing each other's intimates and rejected applicants stewing in bitterness, no one had thought to check if Anita herself owned the bras that she'd shown us in a catalog. My mother's raised brow had asked, well, and Mrs. Okechukwu frowned at me, and my nuanced response degraded into, I wanted to see her bra. My mother pinched her nose, and Mrs. Okechukwu muttered about girls with no home training. That's when my mother got angry. I could tell by the way her left shoulder hunched forward with the effort not to make a fist, how her lips pressed so tight they disappeared. She remained polite to Anita's mother, but seared holes into me with her glare. Wait till your father hears this thing, her cry of last resort. I became my father's daughter then, a confounding creature who had no doubt inherited a vein of insanity from one of his yeye ancestors. I was his problem to solve. My father waited till dinner was done, a meal that amounted to my mother chewing smugly while I tried to swallow gari around the lump in my throat. While my mother cleared the table, my father set up the chessboard on the veranda. It had become a sporadic nighttime ritual, started when we relocated to Port Harcourt a few months ago. As a stand-in for Emmanuel, my father's old friend, I was to match him in chess and swap stories, though my mother drew the line at serving me beer. As a poor strategist, I never won or offered much of a challenge, but my father was a quiet man who did not make friends easily, and I would do. So what is this your mother is telling me, he said, giving me another chance to explain myself. I had the words this time and told him about Anita and bras and the machinations of girls. He listened without interrupting, stealing my pawns as I moved them on the board. My story dangled in the air between us before he began to tell one of his own. When I was your age, my lieutenant, you were in the army when you were 12, I interrupted, knowing my father's penchant for exaggeration. Emmanuel used to call him to task about this, interrupting my father with his laughter and calls for truth, truth. With Emmanuel gone, the assignment fell to me, but my father didn't crack a smile. Lieutenant Ezejiaku was a hard man surrounded by boys and fools and charged to create an army of men. He would wake us up at 3 a.m. to run around the compound in our gear. When the boys complained, he would shout, "Do you think the enemy will let you fetch a wheelbarrow to carry your things around?" Sometimes he would wake two of us in the middle of the night at random to run drills. We would always fight to sleep in the spots we thought he wouldn't pick. Is this about the time he took your gun? The tale, intended to impart some inscrutable lesson, was a stale one my father trotted out at various infractions over my short life. I heard it when I stole lipstick from my aunt's dresser. I heard it when my mother had discovered me gathering ants in a plastic bag to put in a schoolmate's hair. I heard it when I got into a fight with the children who'd let me know my father was strange. My father brought it out again when I wanted to know why Emmanuel couldn't come over to our house anymore, why he'd done what he'd done. He never shared stories from before or after the war, as though he'd been born in the barracks and died the night of the final volley. Yes, it's about the time he took my gun, and it was entirely my fault. Lieutenant stressed to us time and time again the importance of keeping our weapons within reach and sight at all times. Once, I was eating around the fire and placed my gun behind me. That's when he must have taken it. I panicked when I didn't see the gun, and it never occurred to me that he had it. My friends and I took turns rotating so that when one unit was resting, I would have a weapon. It lasted for 3 days until the lieutenant mobilized all the units at once for inspections. When he came to me, he looked me in the eye and handed me my gun. I never sweated so hard in my life. He laughed hard and loud, then went quiet, staring at the chessboard. He was still for so long, I wasn't sure if he was contemplating his next move, or if this was the genesis of the thick skins of silence my mother would spend days peeling off. Just when I went to get her, he moved his queen to check my queen and continued. I was flogged so hard my back looked like pureed tomatoes. Then they buried me in sand for 3 days. After that, I never took my eyes off my gun. Checkmate. I arrived at school the next day a hero. Fellow students patted my back, and I was soon surrounded by the girls who hadn't made Anita's club, and a few who had but wanted to curry favor with the new regime. By exposing Anita and cutting the head off the beast, I'd inherited my very own girl army. During vocabulary class, Ms. Uche asked us to select a word from the dictionary to use in a sentence. The person with the best word would get to lead the class to assembly tomorrow. I feel luminous, I said, heady with power. Stop being obnoxious. This from Femi Fashaken, a thick-waisted girl with a plague of pimples. She'd been part of the girl club and wasn't ready to relinquish her membership. Ms. Uche, already bored with the exercise, intervened. Why don't we query the class? Class, which word is better, luminous or obnoxious? My army responded like a rehearsed choir, luminous, and Femi Fashaken was put in her place. Anita Okechukwu fared worse. Before the supposed bra acquisition, she hadn't been popular, her only claim to fame being that her baby brother was albino, and she couldn't take much credit for that. But she tried, and her incessant conversations about the 3-year-old had earned her the reputation as a strange one. She had fallen even further now, with girls pointing and laughing, which was only to be expected. What I hadn't expected were the boys, who ran behind her during recess and lifted up her skirt, as though my actions had given them permission, as though, because they had seen her bare breast, they were entitled to the rest. It was a boyish expectation that most would not outgrow, even after they became men. At first, Anita yelled and pulled her skirt down and chased the offenders. But soon, after a few days, something cracked, and though she cried, she no longer tried to stop them. This earned her a reputation of being easy that would haunt her long past girlhood. I resisted the urge to walk over to Anita and went instead to the cluster of girls who awaited my command. We sat in a circle looking at each other. I was seated on a crate that once held soft drinks. Damaris Ndibe, who installed herself as my second in command, dragged a smaller girl forward and stood her in front of me. She lied about the job her older brother got. It took me a minute to realize that I was supposed to set this right somehow. The incident with Anita made me the purveyor of vigilante schoolyard justice, but I'd lost my taste for truth. I stalled for time. What's your brother's name? Emmanuel, she whispered. And though it wasn't my Emmanuel, something about the way she said his name, a trigger in her inflection, brought it rushing back. Emmanuel's vigorous laughter, the way he ruffled my hair and pulled up my braids in a bid to make me taller, the way he bartered stories and wit with my father, his growing moroseness, his angry outbursts, the crying that followed. My mother would pull me away from where I eavesdropped and put me to bed. After Emmanuel left, I'd hear them argue, my mother's raised voice saying, "It isn't right, Ezike. He isn't right. I don't want him here." But the next week, he'd be there, and sometimes he'd be okay, and sometimes he wouldn't, and sometimes he'd pull my braids, and sometimes he wouldn't, but he was there until he wasn't. Something pooled in my fist and it itched. The prickling intensified to a stabbing pain I couldn't shake off. I punched the lying girl's nose. Damaris was the first deserter. She led the bleeding, shell-shocked girl from me, sneering over her shoulder. Others followed with rolled eyes and whispered insults. By the end of the day, I was a queen with no pawns. My mother was livid. She spanked me, an undertaking she hadn't performed in years, and it was an awkward thing, like running backwards. There were no half-serious threats to tell my father, no jesting declarations of what incorrigible traits I'd inherited from his line. During dinner, which I wasn't permitted to share with my parents, I sat on a stool in the kitchen, soothing the shrapnel sting on my behind with daydreams of how upset my real parents would be when they discovered these temporary guardians had used me ill. I tried very hard not to think about the little girl and her nose, how it crackled beneath my fist. I tried hard not to think of Emmanuel, how he'd been discovered by his sister with whom he still lived, hanging from the ceiling fan in his bedroom. When I'd first heard the news, before the full weight of it hit me, I'd wondered out loud if his legs were still kicking, like the chickens whose necks my mother wrung like Sutton's howls. My mother had given me a strange look. I tried not to think about that. The week of Emmanuel's death, my father began slipping deeper and deeper into the strangeness that plagued him his entire life. His growing moroseness, his sudden outbursts of anger or mirth, the deep silences he fell into, so heavy my mother would pry and pry till they fell off. When the chance came to transfer to the Port Harcourt branch, my parents took it, hoping the distance would help. This time, my father didn't ask me why I'd done what I'd done, which was just as well. I didn't have any answers. He laid out the chess game, and we began to play. Every once in a while, my mother walked by the door, shoes clipping their anger on the tiles. My father glanced up each time, but I ignored her. He was distracted enough that I was able to maneuver his queen into a precarious position. He paused, leaned back, and rested his head in cradled hands. The stance was familiar, and I knew I was to hear another of his true war stories. We were stationed near a small village around Enugu, where the only thing worth seeing was the concrete highway that passed through. During the day, it was hot enough to peel skin, but at night it cooled. That's when the snakes came out, dozens of them. They curled on the concrete that held the sun's warmth late into the night. He raised and caressed his queen. This time, when my mother walked by, he was too preoccupied to notice. While the snakes slept, Emmanuel would tiptoe to one, slip his rifle through the top of the coil, and shoot off its head. The body flicked around for a couple of minutes and settled down. He would then bring the snake into our tent and cook it, and the smell just turned my stomach. He laughed at how queasy I got, but I chose to sleep outside instead of fighting. I can't imagine that Lieutenant Ezejiaku was too happy with him. I have grown fond of the lieutenant, whom I imagined was like a father to my father. He didn't really mind until one time when Emmanuel crossed the line. We were walking one evening, and coiled on the sidewalk was the biggest snake I had ever seen. I mean, it was bigger around than both of my legs joined together. Emmanuel crept up to it like he always did and fired at the head. The snake went wild. It snapped and flipped so hard it went off the road and into the bush. Its whipping around even destroyed one of the shacks by the side of the road. Every time it stilled and Emmanuel approached it, the snake sensed him and started flipping around again. The next morning, the lieutenant came to our tent and pulled Emmanuel out by his ear. He pointed to a line of villagers that stood not far off. He said, "They want you. You have been killing their gods, and they want me to give you to them for judgment." My father silenced. He took my bishop. I had never seen Emmanuel so quiet. He said only one thing, "Please." Lieutenant Ezgiaku let him know that if one more snake died, he would turn Emmanuel over to the villagers and turn a blind eye to what they did with him. Over the course of the day, a crowd gathered where the large snake lay. No one ventured close enough to touch it. Finally, one shirtless boy, no more than 10, ran up to it with a stick. A woman, his mother no doubt, screamed at him to get back. He ignored her, the way boys ignore mothers, and poked at the creature. Before we could blink, the snake formed a coil so tight around the boy, his chest grew purple. He tried to slide the animal off as one would a pair of too tight trousers. He was dead in seconds. It took 4 days before the snake died and they could bury the body. There was something in my father's eyes, in his voice, as though he hadn't meant to tell this much of the story, as though, perhaps, he'd forgotten that this was what happened. I tried to distract him. "So, what happened to the lieutenant?" "He died, Wando. They all died." "How come you didn't die?" I asked, wanting another story to erase this one. "Because," he said, "when the time came, I ran." My father dragged at his beer bottle with a deep breath and focused on the chessboard. The next move was obvious, my queen exposed to his knight and rook. But he didn't move, and I could see that the veil had come over him. My mother, who'd stopped by the doorway to listen, walked in and gathered me to her. She herded me to my bedroom and sat me down on the bed, where I slid under the covers fully dressed. She stroked my head and began to tell me a story about when she'd been a girl and her cousin found a nest of termites in a tree trunk, and the pulp was so syrupy they stirred it like soup. I listened with every atom, and she animated the story with everything she had, making it easy for us to ignore the cracks. Thank you.